My palm was still shaking and somewhat sticky from sweat. The apartment was completely silent. No TV, no footsteps, just me standing there, staring into space like I'd been plucked out of my life. His words kept echoing in my head, slow and clear, like a recording stuck on repeat. You coming home would just embarrass the whole family. If you still insist on coming back, don't call me your father. For a moment, I wondered if I had misheard him, but no. Every word and tone was cold as ice and solid as stone. There was no slip of the tongue and no room for hope. I clenched my jaw, my throat tightening as if something had lodged there and refused to move. Right immediately, memories began to flood back. I silently paid all of their bills, including electricity, water, and internet, for more than 2 years. Nobody ever mentioned anything, and now they're calling me the family's shame. I quickly took up my phone, my hands still slightly trembling, despite the fact that my mind had begun to cool. I opened the banking app and went down to see my transaction history. My only purpose was to see how much I had spent on my family over the previous 2 years. I needed a number for my power bill, water bill, and internet service, every month, without fail. Each payment was handled on schedule and automatically deducted from my account. For 2 years in a row, nearly $400 per month has been paid without fail. I gently scrolled to the very bottom. Total amount spent, $9,842.17. I stared at that number for a few more seconds, not because I was astonished, but because something inside my chest had suddenly settled. Not grief, not even fury, but just empty space. Nearly $10,000, and now they label me the family's shame. As I glanced at the enormous list of bank transactions, a silent question arose, one that no one in my family had posed in 30 years. Has Jessica ever done as much for our parents as I have? It was not jealousy, and I was not looking for credit. It was merely that if I am deemed the family's shame, who is that standard being evaluated against? I had paid approximately $10,000 in living expenses for them secretly, without asking for anything in return, and without ever mentioning it. What about her? Has she ever had to make a sacrifice or beg for help? Or did she arrive, smile pretty, and make an impact in a lovely dress while holding a successful boyfriend? I was not asking to keep score. I was asking because, for the first time, I noticed that fairness was never considered in this household. I'd grown accustomed to standing on the sidelines since I was a child. In family photos, I was frequently partially hidden behind someone else or captured at the edge of the frame. I wasn't exactly gazing at the camera. Nobody ever told me to step aside, but I always did. Jessica was at the center of every important event in our family, from birthdays and graduations to her breakups. There was always a reason for everyone to band together, console, and celebrate her. I can't recall the last time somebody inquired if I was okay. Jessica is 2 years older than me, but the difference between us was never about age. She was the hope, the future-oriented child that our parents proudly mentioned when relatives visited. And me? In the same talks, if I was mentioned at all, it was as a short footnote. Ryan. Oh, he's fine. I believe he works in technology. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, remained out of trouble, and quietly handled everything, they'd eventually see me. However, they didn't. It turns out that when you're used to being invisible, nobody notices when you leave. I began covering my parents' utility costs, electricity, water, and internet, nearly 2 years ago. My mother called first, and everything started there. That day, she moaned about how the cost of living had risen, how this month's bills had unexpectedly increased, and how their retirement income was no longer sufficient. Then, gently and hesitantly, she said, "If you could help us even a little, it would mean a lot." I agreed. At the time, I assumed it would be only a few months until things settled down. However, the months that followed looked precisely like the previous one. Nobody mentioned terminating it, and there was no backup plan. Every now and then, I'd ask, "Is Jessica helping out at all, Mom?" She'd always evade the topic. Sometimes she'd say, "Just help us this month, your sister will pitch in next time." Other times, "Your sister's covering Dad's medical stuff, that's not easy either." I heard those lines so many times I could recite them by heart, and I just smiled and let it go every time, because I knew none of it was true. So I kept sending the money, nearly $400 per month, reliably and quietly, without complaint. Nobody mentioned it. It wasn't that I didn't care, it was simply that I felt it was the correct thing to do. I used to think that if I was quiet and responsible enough, they would notice. But today, after everything, they look at me and say, I'm the family's shame. After a time, everything around me was silent, and I just sat there, paralyzed on the couch. I still had my phone in my hand. I wasn't angry or heartbroken anymore. There was only one clear emotion sitting in my chest, something like, that's enough. Following that, I opened my banking app. I scrolled down to the automatic payments section, where I had set up monthly transfers to cover my parents' expenses for power, water, and internet. I tapped into each thing one by one and canceled them without hesitation. I did it softly, not to avenge myself, but to preserve the one thing I still had. A semblance of self-esteem, the only thing they hadn't taken away from me. About a week later, I received the first message from my mother, in the same soothing tone she always used. There was no mention of what had happened, nor was there an apology. I just got a notice that the internet bill is due. Can you take care of it? I read the message, glanced at the screen for a time, and then placed the phone down without responding. Not because I was attempting to make a statement, but because, after all, the first thing they thought to say was a request. Pay the internet bill. There was no, are you okay? Or even a basic, can we talk? So I remained silent, and that silence, to me, said everything. 2 weeks later, my father called. The phone rang a few times before stopping. I didn't respond. A few minutes later, he left a voicemail. His tone was sharp and impatient, as it usually had been. The power company called. This month's bill hasn't been paid. What's going on? There was no worry, no mention of what he said the day I called to say I'd be home for Mom's birthday. I listened to the message, then turned off the screen and placed the phone face down on the table. And just like that, I remained silent until my mother's birthday. My mother's birthday was around 3 weeks after my father advised me not to come home. The party went on as normal, with her favorite roasted chicken, cake from her favorite bakery, and a few close relatives gathering around the dinner table. Except for me, everything had been meticulously planned and executed. That afternoon, at precisely 4 p.m., I was sitting in my living room with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold when my phone chimed. It was my mother calling. I gazed at her name on the screen for a few seconds before putting the phone down. I didn't respond, didn't even think twice. My dad called a few minutes later, followed by Jessica. 3 calls in less than 10 minutes, I let them all go. There is no curiosity, no one to reply. I stayed where I was, leaning lightly against the back of the chair, my gaze fixed on the fogged-up glass. The sky outside was a drab gray, no rain, but cold in that silent, creeping manner that suggests winter has just brushed up against your threshold. The communications began to arrive approximately 10 minutes later. Mom was first. Ryan, the power has been turned off. The entire house is dark. Please pay the bill. I picked up the phone and read her message in silence. There was no anger or surprise, just a calm hollowness creeping through my chest, the type you get when you've spent years caring for a family and you're the only one left to bear the burden. Then my father said, "No water, we can't cook. Handle it now." Following that, Jessica replied, "Internet's down. Guests are arriving. Please fix this, urgently." I looked at the clock, 5:12 p.m. I remembered clearly, I canceled all automatic payments exactly 3 weeks ago, immediately after my father informed me that if I insisted on coming home, I should never call him Dad again. And now, in the midst of the birthday party they had instructed me not to attend, everything began to shut down: power, water, and the internet. Each one vanished just when they needed it most. I didn't text back or call. I didn't feel the need to explain. I merely sat there, carefully rotating the cold coffee cup in my hands, my eyes still fixed on the window, as if seeing past all I could see. And in that moment, I realized they weren't phoning because they missed me. They were calling because there was no one left to shoulder their weight. Around 6 p.m., my phone began buzzing again, this time nonstop. Yet it wasn't my parents or Jessica anymore. It was the relatives, who only visit on holidays yet feel entitled to pass judgment. The communications arrived in waves. Some people labeled me disrespectful. One remarked openly, "You embarrassed your mother in front of the whole family." Another, more subtle but just as devastating, said, "Your sister was right, people like you shouldn't show up on a happy day." I read through each message without responding, not because quiet implied agreement, but because I'd grown tired of explaining myself to people who always chose the louder throng above what was right. I was about to put down the phone when the screen lit up again. Aunt Lauren was the only family member who still trusted me. She was calling on video via an ancient app that only she and I still used because we were the only ones who cared enough to look each other in the eyes when it counted. I paused for a bit before answering on the second ring. The first thing I saw was her face, somewhat obscured by the yellow illumination from the kitchen behind her, a location I knew like the back of my hand. Every crack in the wall and every noisy cabinet. But tonight the room felt different. There were clinks of silverware, uneasy laughs, and random small conversation in the background. She glanced at me through the screen, her